Hi, I'm Mark Domes. I'm a senior economist in the U.S. Econ team here at Nomura. And today I want to talk about taxes. In particular, there's just two topics I want to talk about: where we are in the process and what to expect. So where are we? One way to think about this is that the House and Senate are running parallel processes. And right now, the House is one step out in front. In fact, we expect the House to pass its tax bill late this week. And the expectation is this will pass the House, and markets should react favorably upon that. Going to the Senate, they're a step behind. What I mean by that is that their bill is still in committee. We expect the Senate Finance Committee to spend most of the time this week working on this bill and going through literally several hundred amendments to this bill. However, the current expectation is, despite all these amendments, is that the Senate committee will vote this bill out before Thanksgiving, and very likely at the end of this week. So what happens after that? Well, if you have to go back to the Education Rock video, I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill. And what that video taught us was that you have a bill in the House, you have a bill in the Senate. They're different. You have to get together, and they form something called a conference committee to work out the differences. Then it has to be passed by the House again and the Senate again. But although the process has been going pretty smoothly so far, that is, the Senate, the House have been keeping to their timetables and they've been getting things passed, and I think it's exceeded expectations on just how smooth this is going, there's still several major hurdles to clear. And the first, and perhaps the highest hurdle, is in the Senate itself. And so why is that? That's the case because to pass something in the Senate using the rules they're using, they have to get 50 out of 52 Republican senators to agree to the tax bill in order for it to pass. And that's a 96% acceptance rate, and that's just a very high hurdle, just given the diversity of views within the Republican caucus in the Senate. Remember what happened to health care. That's the thinking here, is that it's very hard to pass very complex legislation when you have very diverse views, say, for instance, on the deficit and debt outlook, for instance. There will also be big differences in opinion about the elimination of various deductions. We think that this process of, once the bill leaves the Senate Finance Committee and goes to the Senate floor, we think this process of trying to hash out all these differences and working on all these different compromises, we think that could very well take a month. So although the bills that have been introduced have been proceeding pretty quickly, and as leadership wanted these bills to proceed, the speed at which those bills are proceeding, it is the case, though, that this next step, once it gets out of the Senate Finance Committee, the Senate floor, that's probably where there's going to be the most consternation. That's where there's going to be news stories about this bill not being able to pass, and then the next day they'll say they reached a compromise. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty after at least the Senate Finance Committee, and that's going to be the period to look for how many senators can they get to support this. So at the end of the day, there's really two scenarios. The first scenario is that they pass a bill similar to what's being discussed now, which is you have these deep corporate tax cuts that are permanent, and you also reform the individual side. That's scenario one. Scenario two is basically they'll pass some major tax cuts, mainly for individuals, and there might be some reform on the individual side, but basically they really won't touch the corporate side. They'll put that off to another day. So currently, we think that option one, this kind of full reform with these permanent cuts of corporate taxes, we don't think that's the most likely outcome. It's certainly possible, but it's also the hardest. And why is it harder? And it's basically because it's expensive. To make permanent changes in the corporate tax code, you have to raise money in the long run, so it doesn't have a long run effect on the deficit. The only way they can raise money to do this is to raise taxes on the individuals. And as I'm sure many people who are listening to this know, when one of the ways that they're going to raise revenue is by changing the deductions for, say, state and local taxes, whether on property taxes or on income taxes. That's a very contentious issue. But for instance, that's one of the few ways they have to really pay for this big long-term change in corporate taxes. At the end of the day, we think that's just going to be very hard for them to pull off. It's possible, but it's hard. So instead, we think a more likely outcome is that the Republicans will indeed pass some tax cuts for individuals to the tune of about $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. We think that's going to be relatively easy for them. They've done this before. They did this in 2001 and 2003. And getting agreement on doing some tax changes and lowering taxes on individuals, we think they have a lot of incentive to do this. They've promised their voters they're going to do something on this front. And we also think that it's easier to get 50 out of 52 to agree to that as opposed to the major corporate reforms. But we will see. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty. Just as there was with healthcare, there'll be days in which people are very optimistic about this process. There'll be days when people are very pessimistic. It's going to fluctuate quite a bit. But at the end of the day, we do expect they are going to do something. And we also think that something that they do probably won't be clear until the first quarter of 2018. And the reason we think that, in part, is if you just look at the legislative calendar for the remainder of November and December, taxes is a complicated issue. There'll be a lot of debate. Plus, they also have to deal with the spending for the remainder of fiscal year 2018. And that expiration is on December 8th. So Congress has a very full plate, but they don't have many days left on the calendar this year. Those are some of the main reasons why we think this will spill over into 2018. So thank you for listening.